comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, beginning with verse 21. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said. "This shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For wherever or whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me will find it. What good will it be for a man if he gains the whole world yet forfeits his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what he has done. I tell you the truth, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Amen. You may be seated. This morning, as I review the Gospel of Matthew, and I talk about what Jesus is going through, how he's preparing himself for the next step to fulfill the prophecy that has been long before prophesied that Jesus would do when the Messiah had come into his time. I think about today and all the storms that are happening all around us. I think about all the tragedy that's happening even in our communities. I think about things that try to destroy us, that beat us down and discourage us. And I think that we need a hero. We need heroes in our life again. I shared with you early on about how that Tony the Tiger was my hero growing up, and he caused me to do things that I don't think I could have possibly done on my own. But there's times when we need to move from child heroes to real heroes. Heroes that make a difference in our lives. Heroes that complete what is true and what is necessary. I think about this, and I think about how many people were so disappointed yesterday in opening day of football season. I mean, we look for heroes in some of the strangest places on football fields, as if that's going to change our lives. I know there were a lot of prayers probably said throughout the country yesterday for those heroes that they wanted to rise up and help save them from sure defeat. Some left empty, and most were saddened. Because that's what happens when we look in the wrong places for the heroes. We need to be looking inwardly to ourselves to become that hero in this world today. I think about one of the great broadcasters, and Paul Harvey. And Paul Harvey had a story one day that I heard, and I loved it. And I thought about Ray a lot. Ray Blankenship was just an ordinary young man. He probably wasn't even 21 years old when this happened. He was sitting at his breakfast table looking out over his land, and there was a drainage ditch that came right beside their house. And he started hearing some things happening, and people were running along the drainage ditch, and it had rained recently, and the water began to rage, and it was washing down the ditch. And as he noticed that they were trying to get to something or someone so desperately. So he ran out from his table, and he ran because he knew that it wasn't very long before that water in that ditch would run under the road. And whoever or whatever they were trying to get would probably be lost. It would probably be forever gone. Ray raced to the place where he knew that he could probably retrieve what they were looking for. And at that point, he had found out that it was a small child. And so he desperately wanted to get to that point so that he knew that he could jump in right then and grab that little child and rescue it from those raging waters. So he ran along the ditch, and people were throwing things into the ditch, limbs and sticks and things, trying to hope that the child would grab a hold of it and be saved. But none of that was working. No one could grab the child as it whizzed by them. No one could save this child. But Ray knew that he was going to save this child. He ran to that point, and he immediately jumped, without even thinking, jumped right into that raging water, and he grabbed that child with one hand, and it was pushing him, the water was pushing him down closer and closer to that point where he would go under the road. And he was able to take his free hand and grab a rock and hold on to that rock. And the raging water was trying to separate him from that child. He was pulling that child as hard as he could pull that child closer and closer and closer to him. He was praying that the rescue workers would get to him in time so that this child would be saved. The rescue workers did get there, but only after Ray had made himself, struggled against that current, and was able to get himself out of that water and save that child. What the rescue workers didn't know as they was running toward him and running toward that child is that Ray Blankenship could not swim. Sometimes God gives us opportunities. Sometimes God puts before us what seems like insurmountable odds, overwhelming circumstances, where even our own selves feel that there's nothing that we can do. But there's something in us, there's a spirit within us, a spirit of victory, a spirit of movement within us that says, yes, you can. Yes, you can. And in a moment, without thinking, just by going on faith that Matthew had talked about earlier, the size of a mustard seed. I'm sure there wasn't very much faith in Ray's life at that time that caused him to say, I'm going to jump in that water where I know that I'll be jumping to sure death because I cannot swim. But instead, he knew that he had to do something, and he left the rest up to God. How many of us are willing to be heroes today? How many of us are willing to step up against the odds and step up against even sure death to do something for someone else, to change the world for someone else? Jesus was one of those that knew that he was putting himself into harm's way. He knew that it was death that he would meet on a cross at Calvary. I want to talk a minute about where he was. Jesus had come and he had kept the messianic secret. He had kept that secret from people that he was the Messiah, that he was the one that had been anointed. He was the one that had come to cause us to be able to find our lives. And here he was with the disciples. He had called the disciples to follow him. And he was gathered around a place called Caesarea of Philippi. And Caesarea of Philippi is a beautiful place. You can go there today. You can find it. It's still there. It still looks just the same. You might not see as much water that was pouring out of the caves as you once did, because some things have changed geographically, and no longer do you see the water coming out of the cave. Instead, it goes through cracks in the rock and goes underground and comes out a few yards below. When I went there and saw this beautiful place, I expected to see something that I'd be familiar with. because I'd read about this and I'd studied it. And when I got there and there was no water coming out of the cave, I thought, well, what kind of place is this? What is this? This is not what I expected. But then I looked around and I saw everything else that had been described to me as I had studied as a student. And I realized that this was the place that Jesus was looking at when he was on top of the hill with his disciples. And he was looking down at the people. And he was looking down at the debauchery, the horrible circumstances that the people were living in. And it was there that Jesus was so moved that the Word says he wept. Jesus was looking down at Caesarea Philippi. And this is a place that people had gathered to seek life. Now, they weren't looking to seek the life that you and I seek today. Instead, they were talking about fertility. You see, fertility was so important to the people of that time. That's why all these gods were developed for fertility. If you look in the Greek mythology, you'll see all sorts of gods of fertility. It was important because a family needed children. A family needed children because they needed them to work in the fields. They needed them to work and to help the family to prosper. It was important. Everyone in that family contributes to the life of the family. And if you didn't have the children to carry on your legacy, if you didn't have someone to step up and fill the gap when it was necessary, if you didn't have anything to leave a legacy of, your life would basically, for all general purposes, would have died. And so people came to Caesarea Philippi, this horrible place, this place that the air would be filled with stench from sulfur coming up out of the earth, and they would smell that, and it was there that they would go down into that cave, and it was there that they believed that if they prayed to the devil, that they would become fertile and that they would have many children. Caesarea comes from the word Caesarea, and we know in the medical industry today and the terminology that's Caesarean section, and that's where a split comes and life comes through that crack. They believed that life was coming through the crack in those stones where the sulfur came up from the earth, where the magma was spewing up at times. And the water would bubble up, and they believed that when they were there, that they would receive the life for their families. They would make offerings there. That's where the character Pan came from. You know Pan, that this little boy that played the flute and his lower body looked like a goat. You guys know anything about Pan? You've probably seen some movies, maybe not. Well, it's there that they developed this mythological creature that they would offer up goats in the temple. They built a temple right there beside Caesarea, the split in the rock in the cave. And they called that the gates of hell. Did I say that we look in the worst places for life? We look in the most horrible places sometimes, the wrong places for answers to our lives. Why would anybody that wanted life go looking for life at the gates of hell? It's beyond my understanding that people would think that Satan would offer them life when Satan is only deceiving them and robbing them of their life. And it is Christ that gives them everlasting life. And if that doesn't bother you right now, that people were gathering at the gates of hell looking for life, then something's wrong with you this morning. You ought to have compassion for people that are looking for life and looking in the wrong places. Your heart should be moved. You should be appalled that people are dying all over the world looking for life in the wrong places when you can share with them life more abundantly, life that God gives through His Son, Jesus Christ. Jesus was on that hillside with his disciples. They were about to turn their faces toward Jerusalem. It was a long journey, 6 days by foot. And they were about to turn and go to Jerusalem. And it was there that Jesus asked the question, "Who do you say that I am?" Who do you say that I am today? And I think it was a question for us today to read and say, who are we saying that He is today? Do we have compassion for the dying and the lost? Do we have compassion? Are our hearts filled and aching for these people that are dying and they're looking for life that we have received, that we know to be true? And are we testifying to that? Are we testifying in passionate ways that teach people that you can walk away from Satan and the gates of hell, because you're not going to find life there. You're going to find death there. And if you will look to Jesus Christ, the one that is on the mountaintop right now with the disciples, if you will look towards Him instead of trying to make offerings to the goats and to Satan, instead of trying to do that, thinking that mysteriously and miraculously that Pan is going to come out and play his flute and these bones are going to rise up and they're going to dance along the walls of the cave there. You see, that's what they thought was going to happen one day, as they gathered at the gates of hell. There are ossuaries all alongside the ruins of the temple where they would place those bones, believing that someone greater than them would come and play that flute and those bones would dance. Well, let me tell you what they should have been looking for. They should have been looking for the one that was on the mountainside that was weeping for them. They should have been looking for the Christ that came. They should have been looking for the Messiah that had been prophesied long ago, because it was there that they could have found Jesus, and Jesus would have raised those bones from the dead, because He is the only way to life everlasting. Sometimes we're not passionate with our testimonies. Sometimes we don't have compassion for our brothers and sisters. I'm going to share this in closing this morning. There were 2 men that died on the way up the mountain to Mount Everest. The first man that died, his group saw that he was deprived of oxygen, and they thought he would surely die. And so they didn't want to miss the opportunity to get to the top, to complete their journey, to do what they had set out for. So they left him there to die. And team after team after team passed him by. And it was only one group that found him there, clinging to life so desperately that they stopped their pursuit of Mount Everest and they loaded him up and they took him back down to the camp, to the base camp, where he lived. There was another man sometime later, another man that had almost made it to the top, and he was overcome, and the people thought that he would die, and so they left him and went on and contributed and completed their journey and made it to the top of Mount Everest. And when they came back by, he was dead. We see that there are opportunities for us in some of the most overwhelming circumstances, some of the what seems like sure death, sure defeat, when if we just had, like Ray, just that tiny little bit of faith in our hearts, that tiny little faith of salvation, that tiny little faith of the resurrection, that tiny little faith that says victory is within our grasp. My friends, Jesus is putting opportunities before us. It's time that we stop passing them by, trying to achieve the things of worldliness, the things of fleshliness. Instead, we need to be moved by the same compassion that Jesus was moved before he set his face and headed to Jerusalem to complete the victory of the cross. What are the heroes in your life? Who are the heroes in your life today? Are they you? Are you willing to be that hero? I never will forget that every summer my brother and I and my dad used to go over to Mississippi, and we would go on a fishing trip for 2 weeks. We lived in an old bus that we had painted avocado green, and we camped out on a little point to where we could take our boat and go over to a place called Red Grass Bridge, where the road bed had been flooded with a dam. And it was there that I caught my first fish on Red Grass Bridge. Never will forget that powerful moment. But I'll never forget another moment. It was a moment when my dad was pretty tired, and he was trying to relax, and he sent my brother and I over to an artesian well. We had to walk around a long way around a little slough, and it was there that we would get to the other side, and we would get to that well, and we'd fill up our jugs of the most delicious tasting drinking water that you could get. Came out of that artesian well, just bubbled up right there for us. We filled our jugs and we walked back around. My brother finally carried both of the jugs around, and I decided that I didn't want to walk around that point. Problem was, I couldn't swim. I couldn't swim a lick. I mean, I was a mud duck all that time. I was a little boy, and I would just sit in the water and play around in the mud all the time. Never wanted to swim at all. And so I decided that I would walk in the water across to the other side. It wasn't very far. It wasn't any farther from here to that wall. Problem was, I got into it and I didn't realize it dropped off. I didn't realize it until my head was over the water. And my dad, who had been watching us, saw that I disappeared. And his fear was, he told me later, his fear was that I had fallen into a well, because there were all kinds of wells in that area before they had dammed that water up. And he saw me drop so quickly, he thought I had fallen into one of those wells. And he knew he had to get to me and dive down deep into that well in order to find me. But he took off, and he emptied his pockets. He threw all the stuff out of his pockets, and he dove into the water and swam right to me. And there I was. He said when he got to me that I was screaming and bubbles were coming up out of my mouth, and I was just reaching up. And my dad got to me, and he grabbed me by the hands and jerked me up out of that water. I spent the day with a stomach ache and not feeling very well, and headache from swallowing all that water. But it was a glorious day, because my father became my hero that day. How glorious it is when we have the faith to accomplish the things that seem so overwhelming for us. But we know through God's guidance, through His Spirit, victory is ours.